Well, hello, and welcome to what I think is now the sixth in this series of the Small Data Forum podcast interview series. I'm joined today by Nick Manning, who has worked in the media industry for many years, founder of the media agency Manning Gottlieb in the early 1990s, one of the most informed, important, and I hope we'll find trenchant figures in the media and marketing world for the past 30 years or so. We worked together for a few years at Ebiquity, at the media and marketing analytics business. And when I was there, Nick was adding to the company in terms of its capabilities and its geographies, buying things with Michael Greenlees all over the world and strengthening the business. He now runs a consultancy called Encyclomedia. He's a columnist for Mediatel. And like me, he's a fan of Fulham Football Club. And we'll return to Fulham. Nick, welcome to the Small Data Forum podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. It's good to see you and good to be here.
I'm going to show you the first bit of Small Data Forum podcast merch, which I was given by a friend and a fan of the program. He even put this on the back, Knowles knows. I'm not sure that's true at all. My fellow podders don't know about the merch. It's the only existing merch that there is. Anyway, let's get going. Let's have a think. I'd like to talk to you a bit about what you believe brands can do to cope with the ever increasing complexity of digital marketing. I think it's fair to say, and we've been looking at this for 6 years or so, that things are getting more complex. They're not slowing down. There are more and more links in the chain and value erosion and so on. So I wonder, taking a kind of a helicopter view, not looking at the details of the data, what do you think brands can do to keep on top of the explosion of data? Are there either actions they can take or an attitude of mind that's going to stop them being overwhelmed?
Yeah, well, it's the critical question, isn't it, really? And all marketing is digital marketing now in some form or another. And I think the most important thing that brands need to do is to have the right in-house capabilities. And what I mean by that is not people doing media for them, which is what a lot of people thought was going to happen by now. It's much more upstream than that. It's about having control over your marketing levers. And that especially applies to having control over the digital aspect of marketing. It's by no means the only thing, especially if you're an omnichannel player, but having control over digital channels and digital storage and data and so on is critical now. And I think if anything, the thing that most clients lack is in-house capability for managing their digital channels, the data, and everything else that goes with it. And it's almost like an unending need for that, and to rely less on external parties, and especially external parties where it's difficult to see exactly what's going on within the digital supply chains. So in-house control of digital is particularly important, and I would extend that to strategy as well. What I mean by strategy is commercial strategy, business strategy, and channel strategy, because these days channels, and particularly e-commerce, are critical to so many organizations. You have to have full control over it.
Very good. Now, of course, many CMOs, maybe a decreasing number of CMOs, many CMOs were brought up in businesses that weren't digital first, and they weren't living in a digital first world. Are they, in your experience of, in kind of current experience and in recent years, are they kind of gliding sort of peacefully like swans, but furiously pedaling underneath? I'm particularly impressed. I know that Procter & Gamble is a sort of marketing behemoth and a sort of military industrial complex, and has done some amazing things, particularly with digital marketing, it appears, in recent years. Well, I want to know, how come Mark Pritchard, who's, 61, how come he's sort of so on top of things at P&G?
Well, Mark's a phenomenal guy. And in fact, I saw him speak yesterday. He gave a keynote at the A&A media conference yesterday, and again was extremely impressive, cogent, and everything else. And the reality is, though, that saying what you want to do and making it happen are very different things, especially in an organization like that. And part of the problem with all of these things is the sheer quantity of things that you have to worry about these days, a number of things you have to worry about, and the vast amount of data. So the execution part of it is the critically difficult bit. And a lot of CMOs are very smart in terms of being able to talk about and have a strategy for certain things, but where the difficulties lie is in the day-to-day. Just managing many channels, of distribution, of customer experience, of sales, of media. So channel management is the biggest challenge that any of them have got. And when we say channel management, that's not just about advertising. It's about actually managing all of the channels that you have, obviously including actual e-commerce sites and so on. So just getting your arms around it all is the biggest challenge of all, and particularly in a global organization like P&G, where you have to do that on a multi-market basis. The bigger challenge, I think, is that the CMO function used to be largely seen about brand communications, so developing, advertising campaigns and associated communications channels. Now it's much bigger than that. It's actually managing all of the functionality of channels and managing many more channels as well. So the whole job's got a lot bigger and therefore much harder to do. And that's why you need to have within your organization dedicated teams who control all of that, working with external parties like agencies and other partners. But in-house control of these things, I would say, is now mandatory, particularly when it comes down to the use of data, the issues of privacy, and all of the things that go with modern day marketing.
Now, you mentioned Mark speaking at the ANA conference yesterday. You've personally and professionally been in the heart of the transparency debate for many years, establishing and writing best practice guides with the Association of National Advertisers for many years. On transparency in particular, have we made progress, or is that one still not solved?
Some progress has been made, but nowhere near as much as we had hoped. And in some ways, it's chasing an elusive target, because transparency is not a static thing. In that digital channels, in particular, morph and develop over time. So if you think about 2015-16, when we did the first media transparency study in the US, I think TikTok was a glimmer in the eye of some Chinese entrepreneur at the time. And since then, of course, we've seen the emergence of a number of other channels. In fact, Amazon had barely got going in terms of an advertising channel then. We've now seen the emergence of new retail channels like Walmart and Target and Kroger in the US, all setting up their own media channels. So it's a kind of moving target. And as a result, trying to get not just transparency, but accountability and transparency into those channels is also a moving target. So although some progress has been made, there's still a long way to go. And especially in the area of the online advertising in the open web, when over the last 5 years since the transparency study, it has blown up into massive proportions, become even more complicated. And the ad tech players in the chain have, to put it mildly, made hay while the sun is shining. There are moves afoot in the marketplace. We've seen in the last couple of months some changes there, which I'll come on to a little bit later on. So yes, progress has been made, but there's still a hell of a long way to go. And of course, it's also chasing a dynamic market.
Now, you mentioned Amazon there, and I saw some figures from WARC at the end of, I think it was, maybe it was the beginning of last week, that said that over the pandemic years, if we can, we're not casting them in the past quite yet, but in 2019, Alphabet, Meta, and Amazon, although it wasn't called Meta then, but those three controlled 33% of all global advertising, not all digital, all global advertising. That went up to 40%. It's now 46% at the end of 2021. So approaching half in the hands of those three behemoths. Alphabet biggest, then Meta, and Amazon Or maybe catching up quickly. Of course, Amazon has the advantage of having a much diversified business model. That is not the only way they make their money, but they're making more and more from advertising. Of course, they all operate as walled gardens who don't share data. We don't get clarity and transparency. Is there any hope, do you think? I mean, at a time when Google still don't appear to have worked out what follows the third-party cookie, is there any hope of these walled gardens giving brands a bit more of a glimpse behind those walls?
I think, realistically speaking, there's no particular reason why they should, and therefore we shouldn't expect them to do that. I mean, in the future, first-party data is going to be the most important factor in brand communications, one-to-one marketing, channel management, and so on. And all of those players are built around high-quality volume first-party data assets. Therefore, they can only get stronger. Therefore, the incentive to actually release any of that data to other players is probably even less than it was. So I don't think we can assume that is going to happen, much though we might want it to. So brands have got to get a lot smarter at trying to understand what's working for them and what isn't working for them, because they're not going to get hold of the intermediary data that explains all of that. They're going to have to figure it out for themselves. So the need for greater data science within brands to actually figure that out is going to be crucial, really, not least of all because there's no interoperability, to use the jargon, across all of those platforms. So the data from Amazon, Google, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Pinterest, etc., does not match up. Therefore, you have to manage all of those channels yourselves, and you have to figure out what combinations of those channels works for you. And the only way you can do that really is through testing and controlling, using whatever the best metrics there are for you to measure that in terms of your specific business. And frankly, it's too much and too big to manage in its entirety. So you have to use a lot of judgment. And in the end, we shouldn't get too fixated on data. No matter how much the podcast might be about data, it's also got to be about judgment. And that's where experience and understanding and insight comes in. And in some respects, it's tempting to follow to follow the data trail and collect as much as you can, but in the end, data sufficiency should be a goal as well, which is stop chasing that last terabyte of data and stand back and figure out what's going on. And that's where I think the most important thing is to have a data strategy, have a data management capability, and then figure out what data matters to you, and then draw the line at that.
You've already hinted at this, I think in the answer to the first question, and I was thinking about asking about whether brands should be in-housing media and planning and marketing analytics. And I guess it depends on the brand and the scale and the reach. But you seem to be a pretty strong advocate of having that in-house capability.
I'm an advocate of having a strong strategic and data capability in particular. I see no particular need for most brands to have in-house media capabilities. I think that was for some reason that became an obsession a few years ago, and there's no need or reason to do that. Media strategy and planning is best done by external parties who have got wide market access and are talking to the media supply function day in, day out. What you do need to have, though, you need to have control over your marketing strategy. You need to have control over your data, and particularly data science, and do that independently and in-house as a way of understanding your channels. And it was quite interesting this week, an article in Mediatel by Lawrence Green talking about who should be the lead agency for clients these days. And it argued that media agencies should predominate over creative agencies in being the lead agency, to which my reaction would be, don't have a lead agency, take the lead yourself. You should be controlled as a brand, as a company marketing function. You should be managing all of that yourselves, and then deploying external parties like agencies in terms of helping you do that. By all means, having a point of view, but also in executional terms as well. So the in-housing thing for me, should be much more about control and management of channels than execution and hands-on keyboards of certain functions. Maybe some things are still better placed in-house, like search, for example, but there's absolutely no need. And in fact, it'd be counterintuitive to outsource media execution when so many walled gardens now have their own platforms and have to be managed with great skill and expertise by people who do it day in, day out. And that's where the media agencies are particularly effective.
Now, we've spoken before, obviously not on this podcast, but we've spoken before, obviously a lot about programmatic, and good old ad contrarian Bob Hoffman recently pulled together a whole lot of different studies, PwC, ISBA, Lumen, Ebiquity, all sorts of different studies, and he created his programmatic poop funnel, which amusingly shows that 97%, he claims, as much as 97% of all money invested in programmatic digital advertising is wasted. And he's suggesting that trouble is much worse today for marketers than it was in dear old John Wanamaker's days in the 1850s running his department stores. They don't know which 97% of their money is wasted. They just don't know which 97% is wasted. Clearly, well, my view is he's probably exaggerating to make a point, but is it really is it the blind leading the blind in programmatic at the moment, or is it getting better?
Well, the truth is that nobody knows, and that's part of the problem. And the first thing to say is that, and Bob exaggerated to make the point, and did it very well in the way that only he can. And it was a very interesting piece, although it made a lot of suppositions and pulled in a lot of different data points and mashed them into a sort of bit of a Heath Robinson construct. But the reality is that it is not only is it not known how much is wasted, it's also not knowable, because the levers aren't there to find out right now. So the number could be anywhere between 0 and 100%, which sounds ridiculous to say, but it's true. And for some brands, the number might be 10. For others, it might be 40 or more. Nobody knows. So until you actually get hold of the process and take control over the levers, it's impossible to find out to any great extent. And also, industry averages don't mean much, because they make a number of assumptions which do not necessarily apply to individual cases. So for each brand, they need to basically take control over their supply chain, and they need to do that in a very concerted way, and they need to have people who do only that, because it's a day-long job. The amount of data coming in every day is vast. Runs into gigabytes of data every day. It's not a static marketplace. It changes all the time. So you have to have teams of people responsible for doing that. And then you have to work with external parties in the agency world and through the ad tech chain. But you have to have control over them, and you have to insist on control over them so that you can track the data and money throughout the entire system. And nobody is doing that in its entirety right now. And the reason that the ANA study that's happening at the moment that I'm involved with is important is because basically it's trying to say, okay, this is not an acceptable state of affairs for brands. They need to get hold of this, because they could be losing 50% of value, they could be losing 20% of value or 70% of value, and most of them don't know. And the number of variables in that mix is enormous. So you have to do it systematically, break it down, and take control over your supply chain, and then only work with external partners who are prepared to provide you with the degree of data access and transparency that you need, all the way through from how much you pay your ad tech intermediaries through to how much ad fraud am I subject to, what are my viewability scores, all sorts of other variables like that. And individual brands have got to step up to the mark and do that for themselves. And what we're trying to do with the ANA study is provide them with the tools and guidance and playbooks to enable them to do that, so that they know where to start, how to follow it through, what questions to ask, who to work with, how to work, different use of different systems, ways of buying, whether that be via open exchanges or private marketplaces. The variables are enormous. So in order to get on top of it and get your arms around it, you have to have teams of people who are extraordinarily skilled and experienced in this area, and they need to spend most of their time just managing it. And very few advertisers do that.
And of course, massive challenges with the war on talent, with people available and able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's harder than ever before because everybody wants those people, and therefore there is a shortage of them, and they're expensive people to hire and retain. That's why, in one way, the in-housing of media again, was a bit of a red herring, really, because the ability for advertisers to attract that talent, retain it, keep them incentivized is very difficult. It's far better to outsource that to people whose job it is to employ, skilled media people. But going back to my main theme, really, which is what you do need to have, you need to have a team within your organization that absolutely gets all this sort of stuff, where data science is at the heart of what they do. They understand how to run the levers, and then they need to negotiate with their third parties in terms of their supply chains, and to make sure there is a golden thread that runs through it all. And the sad truth is it's extremely hard to do. It's a slog. Every day is a major, uphill task. But if you really want to do it properly, that's what you've got to do.
Now, talking of Bob Hoffman, I noticed, I think earlier this week, he tweeted, so we're recording this on, I think, day 8 of Russia's assault on Ukraine. And one of the things that Hoffman tweeted, he openly challenged Unilever and said, I don't think these were his exact words, but he said, "You're always banging on about purpose. Why don't you pull out of Russia altogether?" I wonder, without commenting on Bob's particular challenge to Unilever there, what your advice might be for brands who are operating in or with exposure to Russia currently?
Well, that's a very difficult question, isn't it? Because every single organization will have many different factors at play here, including having very large workforces in Russia who are employed by you as an employer, who are being paid by you, and it's their livelihood. So I think we'll come back to that in a minute. But I think if you take your environmental, societal, and governance practices very seriously, it's hard to sustain a situation where you do nothing in the face of the biggest crisis since World War II. And I go back a way, not quite as far as the Cuban missile crisis, but I think this is the hardest, the worst global incident of my lifetime. And I think that's what marks it out as being distinct from Iraq or Afghanistan or others. This is genuinely a global issue now. And what we need to see is global business stepping up to the mark and putting pressure on Putin's regime. And by the way, I think it's important to stress it's Putin's regime, it's not Russia.
Sure.
By saying it's Russia, you're kind of blaming it on the Russian people. That's clearly wrong. It's Putin's regime. And in fact, it's the man himself that's the problem. Global business has to link arms and put pressure on him because if they don't, he may get away with it. And the thing that's going to resolve this once and for all, I believe, and it's purely a personal view, but I think pressure on him from his own people will be the eventual end of this. And the pressure on him from his own people will come when Russian people really start to see the effect of sanctions. They start to lose their jobs. They start to go into shops which are empty. They start to find that they can't get money out. They can't travel. And they end up basically in pre-1989 USSR situation of deprivation. The difference this time, though, is that in my younger years, they were coming out of deprivation into a kind of form of capitalism where goods and services were freely available. They got used to that, and now it's been taken away from them. So the ability to influence public opinion arguably is greater, and business has to put pressure on them. It's very, very tough on the Russian people because they will be the ones who suffer the deprivation. But unless there is internal unrest within Russia, then it's very hard to see how regime change will come about, because it won't come about through violence.
I think that's very wise. Now, just to wind up, I'm not going to ask you, as one Fulham fan to another, do you think Mitrovic will score 50 goals this season? He may well score 50 goals this season. Nor am I going to ask you whether he'll score only 3 next season as Fulham are relegated. I'm not going to ask you those questions. And of course, as you and I know, in the name of the fanzine, there's only one F in Fulham. There's only one proper team in Fulham. But we couldn't not mention Chelsea. Now, since we were setting this up, of course, Abramovich has said that he is now going to sell the club, and that the proceeds, he's writing off 1.5 billion of debt, and the proceeds, initially we thought the proceeds were going to go to people in Ukraine. Apparently now they're going to go to people in Ukraine and Russia. I don't really know what my closing question is. It's certainly not should Chelsea be sequestrated, relegated 7 divisions, never to see the Premier League again this decade. But I wonder if there's a more general point about football club ownership. Particularly, I was listening to another podcast, a football podcast this morning, that was talking about the way that many Newcastle fans, in particular, have opened their arms to the Saudi government, Saudi regime, because the richest football club owners in the world now own their football club. And I was struck listening to the radio a couple of days ago, where there were a couple of Chelsea fans who were calling in after, I think it was before. I think it was yesterday morning, just after it had been announced that Abramovich was selling, and that one was 27 and one was 23, and they were lamenting, all I've ever known is the Roman era, and the money that was taken from whatever private utility it was and fell into his pocket. I feel an overwhelming sense of sadness, given the Saudi takeover of Newcastle, given the big oil that owns Man City and PSG and all of these other clubs. Do you think that this particular crisis? Here's a question for you, Nick. Do you think that this particular crisis will lead there to be changes in the way that football clubs are owned, and particularly, what constitutes a fit and proper club? Maybe we might drift towards something like the German model that includes some fan ownership. What do you think might happen?
Well, I'd like to see us drift towards the German model, which is a much healthier model. It means there's less money in the marketplace, and you have fewer clubs dominated essentially by governments. What we've seen with the Premier League in particular is effectively football being owned by quasi-governmental bodies like the sovereign wealth funds of certain countries. Petrodollars have flown in. And maybe we've got to get used to the idea that can no longer be sustained, because we have to consider a situation where certain parties should not be allowed to control football clubs. It's part of a wider issue, I think, and a big one that maybe we can't deal with all here. But the way that the UK in particular has become a home for some of the most questionable money in the world is a scandal. The way that the Conservative Party has been funded by donations particularly from Russian individuals, is a subject that really ought to be subject to greater scrutiny. London's become a centre for money laundering and so on and so forth. All of that has to change now. I think this crisis is the biggest watershed we've seen in that regard. And I think the football authorities in the UK will now have to step up and look at how they define fit and proper. So all of that's up for grabs now. And the only good thing about the current crisis, and God knows there's not a lot that's good about it, but it is bringing to the fore certain key questions which have been ignored for many, many years now, including particularly the way that the London market has been used as a money laundering centre for Russian money in particular. It's quite good that that's now being questioned, and we're starting to see some proper scrutiny on that for the first time. It means a lot of lawyers and bankers and accountants will have lower bonuses in the future, but I don't think we should lose too much sleep over that. But yeah, I mean, it's, while innocent people are being bombed into submission in the Ukraine, nothing else matters. We have to put that first, and whatever it takes to solve that, it will take. Because if that is allowed to happen without repercussions, then the contagion will spread elsewhere into the Baltic states and potentially beyond as well. So this cannot be allowed to be sustained, and that has ramifications for all sorts of things: industry, commerce, sport. It's good to see FIFA and the IOC being strong-armed into taking stronger action, albeit reluctantly in many instances. So what we're seeing now is a coalition of countries around the world saying, enough is enough. We can't allow this to go on, and they're taking collective action, and that's very, very good to see. Long overdue, and will be the only, I think, beneficial side effect of this entire thing.
Terrific. Nick, thank you so much for your time. We're about on half an hour, which is about the length that we usually run these interview series for. Thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for your perspective. I really greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure. Very nice to take part.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.